They didn't die from swords. They didn't die from arrows. They froze. Forgotten in icy mud, wrapped in cloaks soaked with blood and sleet, medieval soldiers faced an enemy fiercer than any foe. Winter itself. You think your morning commute is rough? Try surviving on frozen horse meat, sleeping spooned with strangers, and marching barefoot through snowdrifts, all while preparing to kill or be killed. In this episode, we're plunging into the brutal reality of how medieval warriors survived the coldest nights on campaign, and the shocking ways some didn't. One battlefield? Never fired a shot, yet buried 1,000 men. Let's dig in. Imagine you're standing in a muddy field in northern France. It's 3 a.m. in December, your boots are soaked through, your tunic's frozen stiff, and your only blanket is a lice-infested wool cloak that smells like a wet sheep. Now imagine you've got to fight someone in 6 hours. Welcome to the medieval winter campaign, where survival wasn't just about dodging arrows, it was about not freezing to death before you even saw the enemy. Most people today think medieval warfare was all clanging swords and thundering hooves, but winter was the true killer. While Hollywood gives us heroic knights charging in bright armor, the actual battlefield in January looked more like a muddy slum full of coughing, shivering men who hadn't eaten properly in days. The first and most obvious challenge? Clothing. Contrary to popular belief, medieval soldiers didn't have standardized uniforms. A peasant levy might show up in whatever he wore to tend sheep. If he was lucky, he had a wool tunic and a thick cloak, both of which performed decently against damp chill. But wool loses effectiveness when soaked, and without underlayers or waterproofing, frostbite was common. Wealthier men-at-arms could afford padded gambesons or lined surcoats. The gambeson, a quilted linen jacket stuffed with wool, rags, or horsehair, was ironically one of the best insulators available. Not designed for warmth, but it trapped body heat under layers of armor. But here's the first twist. Armor helped. You'd think wearing steel in freezing cold would make things worse, right? Surprisingly, layered over a gambeson, chainmail or plate actually trapped heat better than bare wool. Think of it like a medieval thermos. Cold on the outside, but warm within. Of course, if you sat still too long, condensation would freeze, especially around the joints. March too fast, and you'd sweat, which could be a death sentence when temperatures dropped overnight. No Gore-Tex, no dry fit. Just human misery soaked into linen. And then there were the fires. You'd think building a campfire was the obvious solution, except not always possible. When armies moved on enemy land, which they usually did, wood was scarce. Locals burned or hid what they could. Foraging parties faced ambush. And in regions like the Scottish Highlands or northern Germany, the dampness made dry wood nearly impossible to find. So soldiers got creative. Dried animal dung, wagon scraps, or even their own broken shields fed the flames. One chronicler noted that during Edward I's Scottish campaigns, soldiers boiled water with the timbers of their own carts, just to make hot gruel. Now consider sleep, or the lack of it. Without tents, reserved mostly for nobles and commanders, the average soldier huddled under a shared cloak, dug into shallow trenches, or slept spooned with comrades. This wasn't camaraderie, it was survival. Group body heat kept you alive. It also meant lice, fleas, and disease spread like wildfire. You'd wake up with frozen snot on your beard, joints stiff, and morale even stiffer. Some tried to insulate the ground with straw or pine boughs, but again, only if the terrain offered it. Otherwise, it was your own cloak between you and frozen mud. Food? Let's not even go there yet. Just know this. Cold made everything worse. Salted meat froze solid. Bread turned to stone. Ale became slush. Boiling water was a luxury. Most men survived on cold rations, jerky, dried beans, hardtack, if they had anything at all. And warm food wasn't just a comfort, it was a weapon. Commanders who managed to provide hot meals had a psychological edge. It's no wonder leaders like Henry V prioritized portable kitchens and field ovens, not just for nourishment, but morale. Let's pause for a modern comparison. Ever been on a winter camping trip and forgot your thermal socks? Now imagine that, but for weeks. With no backup gear, no sleeping bag, and the possibility that your tent mate might cough himself to death next to you. Welcome to the 100-year nightmare that was a medieval winter campaign. And yet, incredibly, some armies thrived. The Mongols, for example, adapted brilliantly to frigid conditions using felt tents, insulated boots, and high-fat diets. But in Europe, winter warfare was often seen as madness. Campaign seasons typically ran from spring to fall. When kings chose to march during winter, it was usually out of desperation or audacity. Think Henry V at Harfleur or Frederick Barbarossa slogging through the Alps. And each time, cold weather punished the unprepared far more than the enemy ever could. But here's the real kicker. The enemy wasn't always the one across the battlefield. Often, it was your own leadership. Poor logistics, bad planning, or arrogance from knights who thought weather was beneath their concern led to catastrophe. Troops were forced to march through snowstorms, cross frozen rivers, or dig in with no supplies. And when the frostbite started claiming toes and fingers, nobody in shining armor could help. Which brings us to the first great unraveling, a real medieval example that set the tone for winter horror stories to come. Next, what happened when one of the mightiest medieval kings underestimated the cold and nearly lost his entire army because of it? The year was 1242, and King Louis IX of France, later canonized as Saint Louis, was deep into his campaign against rebellious vassals in the southwest of his kingdom. But what he didn't anticipate was that winter would hit faster and harder than any ambush. His army, a mixture of knights, foot soldiers, and conscripts, found themselves trapped in the marshy plains of Saintonge, bogged down by frost, illness, and starvation. Local rebels had destroyed bridges and burned grain stores, and the king's supply lines stretched thin. The real enemy wasn't hiding in a forest, it was the wind screaming across the open fields. Soldiers tried everything. Some resorted to stuffing moss or straw into their boots for insulation, a trick borrowed from northern shepherds. Others lined their tunics with animal fat to block the wind. Messy, but surprisingly effective. Commanders ordered horses sacrificed, not for meat, but for hide. Wrapping oneself in a horse's skin was seen as both grotesque and genius. The carcass kept warmth in and could be slept inside for the night, like a horrifying medieval sleeping bag. Even more desperate were the fire circles. With firewood scarce, men formed tight circles, rotating through the central fire like clock hands. One man warmed up in the center while others waited their turn. This method, while chaotic, kept more men alive than any single large fire could manage. But fights broke out constantly. Who got fire access? Who got the last dry log? One disgruntled chronicler noted that men were killed not by sword, but by selfishness. That may sound dramatic, but in temperatures dipping below freezing, 10 extra minutes of warmth could mean keeping your fingers. Disease, of course, ran wild. The cold didn't just make you miserable, it made you vulnerable. Hypothermia lowered immunity, frostbite opened the door for infections, and the crowded conditions turned every sneeze into a death sentence. Dysentery thrived even in winter, especially with soldiers drinking from half-frozen puddles tainted by camp waste. And yet, commanders still demanded discipline, still expected morning drills, still enforced curfews and lashings for dereliction of duty. Imagine being beaten for shivering too hard to stand. But some units adapted. Take the Welsh archers employed by Edward the Fern during his campaigns into Scotland. These men came from a rugged climate and had traditions suited to rough weather. They built windbreaks out of their own longbows and spare cloaks. They buried heated stones under their sleeping spots, a primitive version of a hot water bottle. They drank warmed ale mixed with herbs to keep circulation up. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Contrast that with the polished knights from southern France who joined the same campaigns. Wearing polished steel and thin surcoats designed for tournament fields, many succumbed to frostbite in days. Nobles often refused to huddle with lower-ranked men, even when it meant freezing alone. Their pride, reinforced by centuries of chivalric nonsense, quite literally cost them fingers, toes, and in some cases, their lives. And then there was food, or the lack of it. Armies were logistical nightmares even in summer. In winter, they were catastrophes waiting to unfold. Supply carts froze in mud. Oxen died on the road. Salted pork turned rock hard and inedible unless boiled for hours, which meant you needed fuel, which, again, was in short supply. So soldiers got inventive. Boiled leather was one grim solution. Men cut up belts, boot soles, even shield straps, soaking them in water until chewable. It had no nutritional value, but it filled the stomach and kept morale just high enough to keep marching. Others raided local villages, not for conquest, but to survive. This in turn bred hatred. Civilians watched their barns emptied, and their daughters dragged away by desperate soldiers who barely looked human. Winter campaigns turned regular troops into marauding ghosts, more feared than any tax collector or bandit. It's no surprise that in regions like the Balkans and the Baltics, peasants would abandon entire settlements during military marches, preferring the forest and starvation over sharing a camp with freezing, starving warriors. Let's take another modern moment to reflect. Ever seen a soldier on deployment in winter gear, thermal gloves, high-tech boots, and portable heaters? Now picture that same soldier wearing 2 layers of damp wool, wrapping his feet in straw, eating boiled harness straps, and sleeping under a rotten horsehide with a fever. And somehow he's expected to fight the next day. When things got especially dire, armies would construct what they called earth huts, makeshift dugouts lined with mud bricks or thatch. These structures trapped warmth well, but were breeding grounds for disease. Smoke had nowhere to go. Moisture built up. Men slept shoulder to shoulder, coughing through the night, hallucinating from fever. In some cases, these hovels collapsed under snow weight, smothering the soldiers inside. One German account from the Teutonic campaigns describes a dozen men entombed in their own warmth, never waking up after the night. But among all this misery, one strategy stood out: shared suffering. Armies that bonded, that shared rations, took turns at the fire, helped bind frostbitten feet, survived longer. Charismatic leaders who ate with their men, froze with them, and cursed the weather alongside them became legends. Henry V slept in the open at Agincourt. Richard the Lionheart, for all his cruelty, shared camp miseries on the Third Crusade. And even Louis IX, after nearly losing his army to the cold, adjusted future campaigns to better prepare for weather, organizing supply chains, demanding better cloaks, even bringing physicians on campaign. Still, the cost was high. For every soldier who adapted, 3 more perished or returned home crippled. Not from arrows, not from swords, but from the quiet, relentless killer called winter. And yet, the campaigns continued. Armies marched, froze, and marched again. Because behind every frostbitten toe and shared fire was a larger question: why were they even there? Why risk death by cold for a king's ambition? That's the deeper thread we'll unravel next. How the drive for conquest, glory, and God pushed men to endure the unendurable, and how winter itself became a strategic weapon wielded by nature and by savvy commanders alike. It wasn't long before kings and commanders started factoring the cold not just as an obstacle, but as a weapon. The harshest generals weren't the ones with the most men or the heaviest swords. They were the ones who understood that nature could fight for them. If you couldn't beat the enemy in open battle, starve them in a frozen forest. Let their fingers blacken before you ever lift a sword. The most notorious example? The Livonian Crusades. In the 13th century, the Teutonic Knights pushed deep into the pagan lands of Prussia, Lithuania, and Livonia. Their campaigns were as much about converting souls as conquering land, but winters in the Baltic were utterly merciless. Rather than avoid the season, the Teutonic Knights embraced it. They used frozen lakes as highways, riding across surfaces too soft in summer to support heavy cavalry. Their war horses wore leather wraps for grip. Their armorers added wool padding to helms. And their siege weapons, often dragged on wheeled carts, glided effortlessly over ice. To them, winter was a strategic asset, but it cut both ways. Lithuanian war bands, far more accustomed to the terrain, knew the woods like the backs of their frostbitten hands. They used snow-covered paths to ambush knights who couldn't hear footsteps over crunching ice. They lit false fires to lure enemy patrols. They vanished into blizzards, leaving nothing but footprints, only to circle back hours later. Their bodies were gaunt, hardened, and barely clothed by Western standards, but they understood survival better than their armored foes. And while generals plotted and soldiers shivered, the cold shaped everything else too. Horses, for instance, were crucial, but incredibly vulnerable. Without fodder, they died fast. Grazing was impossible, and carrying hay was inefficient. Many armies bled their horses, taking small amounts of blood to mix with broth or drink straight for iron and calories. It wasn't pleasant, but it saved lives. And when a horse finally collapsed, its meat, hide, even bones became resources. A dead horse wasn't waste. It was breakfast, firewood, and insulation. Dogs, too, played a role. Some armies used them not just for protection, but warmth. Packs of dogs would sleep near soldiers, shared for body heat. There's even record of Mongol warriors keeping tiny dogs in their cloaks, nestled like living hot water bottles. In European armies, dogs were more often guards or scavengers, But when the temperature dropped below zero, hierarchy vanished. Warmth didn't care if it came from a mutt. One brilliant, if slightly disgusting trick used especially by Eastern European troops was burying urine. Soldiers would relieve themselves into small pits, then bury the warm liquid to create tiny heat pockets under their bedding. It sounds absurd, but in sub-zero conditions, that pocket of earth stayed just warm enough to prevent freezing through the night. When frostbite is chasing your toes, dignity takes a back seat. Then came the mobile shelters. Not every army had them, but some elite units, particularly siege engineers or royal guards, built collapsible frames out of wood and leather. These could be transported on carts, set up in under an hour, and draped in layered hides to trap heat. Think of them as proto-tents, primitive but effective. A few even featured smoke holes and small internal braziers. They weren't common, and certainly weren't for peasant soldiers, but they show just how inventive some commanders were in mitigating winter's wrath. Of course, all of this required discipline. Without it, even the most brilliant strategy failed. Winter could break morale like a hammer. Soldiers fought not just hunger and frost, but despair. Letters from French troops during the 100 Years' War describe men crying in silence at night, hiding it from their comrades. Not out of shame, but because if the others broke too, no one would make it home. Commanders knew this. They introduced songs, shared stories, even rudimentary games to distract their men. One source recounts a mock duel tournament held in a snowy camp in Burgundy. Not for honor, but to lift spirits. The psychological edge mattered. Marching a cold, wet, half-starved army into battle was a recipe for disaster unless the men believed they could still win. So leaders crafted myths. The snow is God's test, some said. Or, only the pure can endure the frost. Religious justification ran rampant. Crusading armies in particular saw winter hardship as proof of divine trial. You weren't freezing because of poor planning. You were proving your soul's worth. In many ways, faith became a thermal blanket, one you wrapped around your suffering so it meant something. But even belief had limits. Take the 1360 Black Monday disaster. On Easter Monday, a massive storm struck the English army of Edward III outside Chartres. Lightning killed hundreds, hail battered tents into tatters, and the cold wiped out as many as 1,000 men in a single night. This wasn't during a siege or battle, just the army camping between engagements. It was so devastating that Edward himself interpreted it as divine punishment and promptly agreed to a truce. One night of weather did what years of combat couldn't. It ended a war. Not every commander learned the lesson. Some marched right back into the frost, thinking preparation alone could conquer nature. Others adapted. The Polish-Lithuanian forces, for instance, built entire winter training programs. They drilled soldiers in snow marches, constructed standardized winter kits, and even experimented with fur-lined armor components. They understood that the cold wasn't an obstacle. It was a permanent part of the battlefield. Food remained the biggest challenge. When fuel was available, soldiers cooked pottages, thick soups of whatever was scrounged. Bones, dried beans, barley, even weeds. These stews were communal, simmered over hours, and shared in wooden bowls passed hand to hand. The warmth did more than nourish. It created bonds. A hot bowl meant someone was watching the pot. Someone gave a damn whether you lived or died. And in the middle of all this, life kept happening. Soldiers carved crude dice to gamble with. They passed around story scrolls. They carved charms into bits of wood for loved ones. They fell in love, wrote poetry, buried comrades, and sometimes danced just to keep blood flowing. One Flemish account describes men linking arms and stomping around fires in rhythmic bursts, half song, half survival drill, because even in the bleakest winter, men found ways to be human. Still, the frost took its toll. Marches slowed. Campaigns stalled. Entire offensives were postponed or canceled because too many men had lost toes, legs, or morale, and sometimes armies never recovered. A single brutal night could ruin a season's plan. But the worst part? It never showed up in the victory scrolls. No knight was immortalized for not freezing to death. No commander won glory for keeping his men warm. But without those silent victories, there were no grand battles, no sieges, no history. Winter was the battle before the battle, and only those who mastered its misery got the chance to fight the enemy they'd come for. Next, we'll follow one such army into the coldest front of them all, a frozen battlefield where the ground cracked underfoot, swords snapped mid-swing, and death came not with a roar, but with a shiver. The winter of 1475 in the Carpathian Mountains was brutal even by medieval standards. The Polish king Casimir IV had sent a large expeditionary force to support his Moldavian allies against the encroaching Hungarians. The army, composed of knights, light cavalry, infantry, and a contingent of German mercenaries, found themselves trekking through frozen mountain passes where the sun barely rose above the ridgelines, and every breath turned to frost on your beard before you could exhale it. The first challenge wasn't the enemy, it was the climb. Horses slipped on icy paths, carts snapped axles, and men slipped and cracked bones on the hard-hidden rocks beneath the snow. Those who fell behind were often left to die. There was no time, no spare muscle to carry the injured. For every 10 men who started the ascent, only 8 reached the other side intact. And those who did found no welcome, only a plateau of wind and ice where campfires flickered weakly and food froze solid. What made this campaign particularly vicious was its speed. Casimir had hoped to catch the enemy unprepared, so he pushed his men to march day and night. That meant fewer fires, less rest, and even less food. By the 3rd week, the bread rations were so hard they had to be soaked in wine or snowmelt just to chew. Salted fish, usually a welcome source of protein, became useless bricks unless cooked. But with wood too scarce to burn, many soldiers gnawed them raw or traded them for a spoonful of warm gruel, if they were lucky enough to be near the royal cook fires. And yet, the army pushed on. Why? Because turning back was just as deadly. The mountain passes behind were frozen tombs by then. Snow had collapsed the trails, and local guides refused to return. The men had no choice but to move forward, into an open valley rumored to hold both the enemy and precious stores of grain. What they found was worse than either. An abandoned hamlet buried in snow, its roofs caved in, and every well frozen solid. This was when the real unraveling began. Frostbite swept through the lower ranks like wildfire. Toes blackened and split. Fingers went numb, then disappeared. One German mercenary was found weeping silently, still clutching his sword, his hands frozen around the hilt. The surgeon had to break his fingers just to pry it free. Camp physicians, often just barbers with knives, did what they could, usually amputations by candlelight, no antiseptic, no morphine, just a swig of wine and a belt to bite. Infection followed. So did death. Horses began dying en masse. Without fodder and already weak from the climb, they collapsed in the snow. Soldiers stripped them for meat, then boiled the hooves for gluey soup. Their hides became crude blankets, tents, even shoes. Nothing went to waste. It was said that if you saw a fresh carcass in the morning, by noon it would be bones. Morale cracked. Some men mutinied, demanding they retreat. Others deserted, disappearing into the woods where wolves waited. And wolves weren't the only predators. Bandits, drawn by the smell of desperation, circled the camps. They struck at night, not to kill, but to steal firewood, food, or anything remotely warm. In one raid, a dozen men froze after their cloaks were stolen in their sleep. The next morning, their bodies were discovered curled together like a pile of discarded dolls, frost crusted over their eyelashes. Still, some units held firm. The Lithuanian light cavalry, hardened by years of skirmishes along the steppes, adapted with stunning precision. They taught others how to sleep upright on their horses, how to wrap cloth soaked in grease around their limbs to seal in heat, and how to use river ice as camouflage for nighttime movements. They foraged tree bark, boiled moss, even hunted rats. Survival wasn't just possible, it was methodical. Leadership mattered too. One Polish captain, Wojciech the Lame, became legendary not for battlefield heroics, but for keeping his company alive. He split his men into rotating warmth squads, assigned fire guards, and rationed food with surgical precision. Every morning he walked the perimeter, personally inspecting boots and gloves, checking fingers for early signs of rot. Under his command, only 2 men died before spring. He was later knighted, not for killing enemies, but for saving friends. Then, after 6 grueling weeks, the enemy arrived. The Hungarian army had been watching from the southern hills, biding their time. Unlike the Poles, they had local knowledge, lighter gear, and intact supply lines. Their scouts knew the land, their fires never went out, and their morale was high. When they struck, it wasn't with force, but with patience. They surrounded the frozen army and waited. Days passed, snow fell, tempers rose. The trapped troops began turning on each other. Small skirmishes broke out over food, over fire access, even over who got to sleep next to the dogs. One brutal night, a group of starving soldiers broke into the officer's tent and demanded better rations. The officers fought them off with swords. By morning, 6 men were dead. There was no burial. The ground was too hard to dig. Casimir's commanders knew they had to act. A breakout was planned. Not an attack, but a frantic escape. Under cover of a snowstorm, they abandoned the valley, leaving behind tents, broken wagons, and the dead. They pushed east, hoping to find a monastery or village with supplies. And against all odds, they did. A fortified church where monks took them in, fed them barley broth, and let them rest in stone halls warmed by coal fires. The army had lost nearly a third of its men. Most never saw battle. Most never saw spring. What this campaign revealed more than anything was that even the strongest army was powerless without preparation. Weather didn't care about noble blood or divine cause. It froze both king and peasant without distinction. The men who survived did so not through bravery, but through adaptation, through humility, through raw, miserable persistence. And it proved something else, too. In medieval warfare, victory wasn't always measured by conquered land or slain foes. Sometimes survival was the only triumph that mattered, but the lessons didn't end there. In the final part of our journey, we'll explore how winter reshaped entire military doctrines, influenced the design of weapons and clothing, and forever changed the way future generations approach the cold. Because when the frost finally lifted, it left more than corpses behind. It left wisdom etched in every scar. When the survivors of those brutal winter campaigns limped back home, some maimed, some forever shaken, they didn't return empty-handed. They brought with them hard-earned lessons, not just of battle, but of endurance, adaptation, and the savage indifference of cold. And slowly, over generations, these bitter experiences began to shape the future of medieval warfare. Commanders took note. Winter wasn't just a seasonal nuisance, it was a tactical reality. If it couldn't be avoided, it had to be mastered. From the late 14th century onwards, a shift began to emerge. Armies started stockpiling winter gear, not just cloaks, but fur-lined hoods, thick mittens, and water-resistant boots made of oiled leather. Kings issued winter allowances for soldiers, extra salt, dry beans, even portable braziers for elite units. Some quartermasters experimented with insulated carts, lining the interiors with straw and hides to keep supplies from freezing. Even armor evolved. In colder regions, chainmail was sometimes stitched into quilted jackets for warmth, a fusion of defense and insulation. Helmets were fitted with padded liners that absorbed both shock and chill. And blacksmiths, recognizing that brittle steel cracked in the cold, adjusted the carbon content of their blades in winter campaigns to make them more flexible, even if it meant sacrificing sharpness. Military architecture changed, too. Outposts along northern frontiers were no longer simple wood palisades. They grew thicker, with double walls to trap heat and subterranean bunkers to protect garrisons from wind. Fireplaces were built into tower designs, and chimneys became more common, not for luxury, but survival. After all, a frozen watchman was a useless one. The impact of cold reached all the way into battlefield tactics. Ambushes were now timed around weather patterns. Heavy snowfalls were used as cover for nighttime raids. Some armies deliberately marched into snowstorms, trusting their hardened troops could endure longer than their foes. Retreats were staged through frozen bogs, where pursuers risked falling through weak ice. Winter became not just a season, but a tool of war. Training changed as well. In Scandinavia, troops were drilled in snow movement, how to fight on ice, how to move quietly through powder, how to build fires with frozen fingers. In Eastern Europe, crossbowmen trained in gloves, perfecting their aim even while shivering. Cavalrymen were taught to walk their mounts instead of galloping, to conserve energy and prevent the horses from slipping. A smart soldier became a cold soldier, measured, methodical, and always thinking 2 steps ahead of the frost. But beyond strategy, something deeper changed: the culture of command. After countless failed campaigns, monarchs realized that survival wasn't just about grit, it was about care. The best commanders were the ones who checked on their men's boots, who tasted the broth themselves, who ordered fires built before tents. Harsh winters created more compassionate leaders, or at least more practical ones, because a dead army couldn't win wars. And the soldiers themselves, they adapted. They passed down survival tricks like sacred lore. Wrap your feet in cloth soaked in vinegar to keep them warm. Don't sleep alone, ever. Boil pine needles for vitamin-rich tea. Rub snow on your cheeks to keep frostbite from setting in. These weren't written in manuals. They were learned in trenches, whispered around fires, carved into shields. Folk wisdom became frontline doctrine. Religious orders, especially the Templars and Hospitallers, took it a step further. Their winter campaigns during the later Crusades forced them to innovate. Monastic knights developed layered wool uniforms under their habits and created centralized heating spaces inside their fortresses. They even kept medical records of frostbite cases, noting which treatments worked, whether it was warmed wine compresses or goat fat salves. These orders became centers of winter warfare knowledge, quietly influencing armies across Christendom. Trade responded too. By the 15th century, entire industries catered to military winters. Furriers sold bear pelts for command tents. Blacksmiths made compact fireboxes. Herbalists sold dried yarrow and juniper for respiratory issues common in cold camps. And perhaps most significantly, food preservation advanced. Smokehouses became vital military assets, drying meat for months-long storage. Armies learned to carry pickled vegetables, not just for taste, but to stave off scurvy. One remarkable development came from the Burgundian military administration under Charles the Bold. Obsessed with logistical perfection, Charles commissioned a series of mobile field stoves, portable iron braziers that could be carried on carts and used to warm both tents and cooking pots. These devices were expensive and rare, but they allowed his officers to maintain morale deep into the frost. His troops called them iron fires, and the mere sight of one could spark cheers in the camp. And yet, even with all these advances, winter never lost its sting. In 1490, during the Wars of the Roses, a Yorkist force attempting to march north through Cumbria was trapped by a sudden blizzard. Despite warm cloaks and well-packed rations, over 100 men perished in a single night. Their horses froze in place, eyes open, heads bowed as if in mourning. It was a grim reminder. Nature didn't play favorites. It respected neither progress nor prayer. Still, humanity endured and learned. By the dawn of the early modern period, medieval soldiers weren't just surviving winter. They were navigating it with precision. Campaign seasons began to extend. Winter raids became standard in border conflicts, and entire units were designated as cold weather specialists, deployed specifically when frost gave them the upper hand. But perhaps the most enduring legacy was psychological. Winter stripped away illusion. It revealed what a man truly was when stripped of comfort. It forged bonds that no courtly ceremony could match. Men who'd shared a frozen trench, who'd spooned for warmth beside a half-dead horse, trusted each other in ways no banner could guarantee. For all the suffering, the frost created something profound: resilience. Not the Hollywood kind, with swords and swelling music, but quiet, stubborn survival. The ability to march one more mile on frozen feet, to smile at a joke with lips cracked from wind, to choose, again and again, to live. And when spring finally came, and it always did, it brought more than warmth. It brought memory of the dead who didn't make it, of the tricks that saved lives, of the leaders who led from the front, and those who froze behind their gold-trimmed tents. The coldest nights forged the sharpest edges, not just in steel, but in spirit. And that's how medieval soldiers truly survived. They didn't just endure the cold, they learned from it, adapted to it, and passed on the lessons in every scar, every tale, and every silent nod around the campfire. We like to think we've come a long way. Central heating, thermal underwear, instant soup. But the raw truth? Most of us wouldn't last one medieval night, because survival back then wasn't about comfort. It was about grit, brotherhood, and brutal adaptation. So, here's the question. Could you have survived without a sleeping bag, sharing a frozen trench with lice, frostbite, and a half-dead horse? Would you trade your hoodie for a damp wool cloak and your bed for a pit in the snow? Drop your thoughts in the comments. What shocked you most? What survival tactic actually impressed you? And hey, if you've ever complained about cold feet, maybe subscribe. There's a whole world of medieval misery waiting for you. Hit that bell and we'll keep digging up the past.